Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Sloan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Vice President for Advancement here. And I am particularly delighted to bring Gregg Ficery here tonight. Gregg and I met in Atlanta a couple of months ago where he works, and he told me about his new book, and I thought it was such an interesting idea that I was really delighted that he was willing to share his story with the Marymount community. Just a little bit about Gregg. He's a graduate of Marymount's MBA program from the class of '95 with an undergraduate degree from Georgetown in 1988. He's a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the birthplace of professional football. Gregg currently splits his time living in Watertown, Florida, and Atlanta, Georgia. His 30-year career in the financial services sector includes founding his business valuation consulting firm called Integra Valuation and Advisory Services in 2011. Due to his love for football and his hometown of Pittsburgh, he spent 15 years researching the origins of pro football, which led him to write his recently released book, Gridiron Legacy, Pro Football's Missing Origin Story, that he's going to share with us today. Please welcome Gregg Ficery.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming out on this rainy evening. Thanks so much to everyone, for Irma and Dennis for coordinating and inviting me. It's great to be back home. I love when Irma says welcome home as a graduate. It's great to be back. So I'll tell you about a little bit about myself. I can't separate myself and my background from the story. So as Dennis mentioned, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and when I was growing up in the 70s, it was the best time as a sports fan to be there. We were called the City of Champions, and we had the Steelers and Pirates even, believe it or not, winning the World Series and the Super Bowl that year. And that's me as a little fellow with Willie Stargell. They call Pops. I'm on the right there. When I was 9 years old in 1973, we know that because he has the Roberto Clemente patch on his arm from the year after he died, tragically, in '72 on New Year's Eve. And Pitt even won a national championship with Tony Dorsett, as he was Dorset in college, but that was in 1976. And the Penguins came later, but that's another story. So when I was young, though, baseball was king. It was America's pastime, and it happened before I was born, but it was legend that we beat the evil Yankees in the 1960 World Series on Bill Mazeroski's walk-off home run in the bottom of the ninth, and it was fun to meet Maz and some old Pirates there at a golf outing a couple years ago. And when my grandfather passed away, sometime in the 90s, I found that ticket stub from Game 7 in his trunk of special memorabilia. It was always so meaningful to him and everybody from Pittsburgh to let us know that we were as good as anybody else. You know, we sort of had a small town mentality, but sports is a big lift just psychologically to the people of Pittsburgh to put us on the map, to feel like we weren't just a blue-collar town and, lesser educated in the Rust Belt. We had potential, and we could be successful, with anybody. That whole zeitgeist, is very meaningful to the people of Pittsburgh, as it still is today. That the Steelers especially give us such a sense of pride. So, but off to Georgetown I went from Pittsburgh. Doesn't happen every day, and it was a great time to be there too. We had, the Hoya Paranoia was great. We won the national championship when I was there in '84. Some pretty prominent alumni. Yes, that's Bill and Hillary there in their early days when Bill was at Georgetown. I lived in the dorm where Bill lived, Harbin Hall, and pretty. I like my little selfies. Obviously, I was pretty bold to get a selfie with John Thompson. I mean, that's terrifying if you remember what he was like. I might be the only person that ever succeeded in that. And getting one with Bill at a reunion in I guess I was 88, he was 68. I think that was 2018. But if we learn nothing else from a Catholic or Christian education, is that we all fall short of the glory of God, and we can't be too proud of our accomplishments, but it's a great place to have graduated from, as was Marymount. So off I went with my values-based education into the career world, and it was tough back then. As Rodney Dangerfield said, I'll tell you, it was tough. I mean, we had, it was the high-flying 80s and 90s. Some of my classmates went off to Wall Street to work at places like Drexel and Michael Milken, and things, Gordon Gekko-like stuff happened. And a lot of things blew up through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. We might remember some of these companies and their frauds. They made national headline, but my career was checkered as well. One thing they all had in common was they went to jail. And people think that there's no consequences to business misbehavior, maybe just a slap on the wrist or a fine, but it gets real when you go to the big house. So my career started, you might recognize some of these situations, but between, I guess, Freddie Mac here in DC and WorldCom, which had a headquarters in Washington as well. I moved to Atlanta in '96 from DC, and when MCI was still a standalone company, and I was there when WorldCom took over as well. So between those situations, which were two of the biggest accounting frauds in corporate history, and the dot-com bust that happened, after 5 or 6 jobs, I was starting to feel a little bit like Liz Taylor and her 6 husbands. It was just like, nothing's really working out, and is it me or is it them? And that's kind of making light of it, but in actuality, I was pretty depressed. I went through a period of questioning, what this was all about. The whole business world seemed so corrupt, and I was just having a hard time finding any meaning in it other than making a living. So I was a good unemployed after 9/11 for about a year, wondering what I was going to do. And I decided to go down, focus on some sports for a while, things I enjoyed. My cousin, Bob Zupsik, played for the Red Sox for a while. He was a first-round draft pick out of college and good upstanding Christian. I think he went to Oral Roberts, and he played for the Red Sox for several years. And in his last year, in 1994, he was on one of the great White Sox teams ever that was loaded with talent. They were in first place with a bevy of all-stars, Carlton Fisk and Jack McDowell and Ozzie Guillen and Frank Thomas, one after another. And then there was Bob playing in right field. And he was going to make it big. They might have gone to the World Series, except there was a strike of '94, and they never finished the season. And he never got his chance at playoff or World Series glory, and he never played another game again. He got released the next year. So, and in many people's view, the point being that after, similar to corporate America, and all of those companies, and baseball it's very difficult to recover from a shocking crash or lack of integrity and scandal like that. Many companies, WorldCom became Verizon, Arthur Andersen became Accenture, ValueJet became AirTran. I mean, one rebranding after another just concealed a lack of integrity in business practices. Enron went away, and as I said, many of them went to jail. So it seemed that baseball also lost its place in American culture as the America's pastime at that point, and many people argue that that's when football took over as our favorite sport. However, nobody kind of knew where its history at that point. So I had heard some stories growing up in Pittsburgh that it was the birthplace of pro football, and my father took me out to Canton, Ohio, to the Hall of Fame at one point, and we sort of learned a little bit about it, and I developed a curiosity, and they admitted, advertised or displayed in Canton that Pittsburgh was the birthplace, and they called themselves the cradle of pro football, and it was a little nuanced, so I decided to spend some time reading about the history of pro football, and it just led me down a lot of really super interesting rabbit holes. So to share some of that story with you, basically, American football evolved out of soccer, which, or out of rugby, which evolved out of soccer. And soccer, we get mocked in America for sort of taking, not calling it football, which they call it everywhere else in the world. But in actuality, that's a bad rap, because the word soccer comes from a British word, association football was called. And they had a habit of calling things euphemistically, like rugby was rugger. And so association became soccer, and that's where the word soccer comes. So we didn't actually, take the word and misuse it. It was their word. So as far as rugby went, some kid at the rugby school in England called William Webb Ellis decided one day when he was bored in a low-scoring soccer game to pick up the ball and just take off and start running around the field with it. And a new sport was born, and they chased him and kind of played keep away, and they called it, it became known as the carrying game, and so rugby sort of evolved out of soccer. And then as people, migrated to the United States, sort of during the Civil War, something new, sketches started appearing in some magazines. Harper's was a big one. Soldiers playing in camps and sort of doing a new freestyle form of rugby and some different flavors. And somehow, not really clear how, but they started organizing a different form of the game. And when life returned to normal after the Civil War, college football started in 1869, 4 years after the war. So the first college football game was played between Rutgers and Princeton in New Jersey, and in 1869. And Rutgers players wore red scarves on their heads, which led to their nickname, the Scarlet Knights, which they still have today. And Princeton being, the Ivy Leagues being the smartest people in the room, they sort of took off with organizing the sport in the Ivy League, and Yale and Harvard and others joined in, and they played each other. And every year, this Yale sort of took over. A fellow named Walter Camp became known as the father of American football. And he became the organizer every year of the rules committee that sort of became the NCAA later as the game kept evolving. But nonetheless, it sort of looked a lot like rugby for several years into the 1890s. But as things happened, these adults then, after 15 years or so, men still wanted to play football after college, and they had amateur teams. And so imagine your country clubs around here. There's a club next door, I think, with the golf. Imagine these clubs having football teams, and they had wrestling teams and basketball teams. And they were all part of something called the AAU, Amateur Athletic Union, which still exists today. AAU basketball is still huge. So it was around way back then. But if you wanted to compete in their national championships, you had to be amateur. So they had a short leash on making sure that nobody got paid cash to play any sport, or else you were banned from AAU competition. So with football teams, as they evolved, people started getting compensated in loose ways, like food or memberships or watches, and things they could pawn and cash, and there's getting around the rules. And eventually, of course, what would happen? Somebody eventually was going to get paid some cash. And so that would define the first professional football player before a team. Like, question forever was, who was the first professional player? But nobody ever really knew, because it was covert and under the table, so it was a big mystery. And but everybody knew that the first teams, were in Pittsburgh, and there were these teams: Pittsburgh, Allegheny, Duquesne, Greensburg, Latrobe, which is outside of Pittsburgh, where Arnold Palmer was from. And they knew that if you went back far enough, you were going to find the first pro there. So somehow, the Steelers legendarily had a lot of documents in their archives that they sent out to the Hall of Fame when it opened in 1963 to figure out who may be, the first pro player. And they found an accounting ledger. It's always the accountants that, get in trouble, just like in business. So they recorded that this fellow from Yale named Heffelfinger got $500 in cash in 1892 to play for the Allegheny Athletic Association against the Pittsburgh Athletic Club. And this became known as the birth certificate of pro football. And it's on display in the Hall of Fame. So this is 28 years before the NFL was founded in 1920. So nobody really appreciates that there was 20 years of pro football before the NFL. And he gets credit still for being number one. So every year, quickly, things evolved. The next year, the first actual contract got signed. It was by this fellow that played at Pitt for the Pittsburgh Athletic Club. And just connecting some dots, one of the guys that played with him against Heffelfinger the year before, Jim Lallis, on the left, he retired and started his own team as a coach that in 1899 and 1900 had this player that's going to become the main character in our story going forward. His name is Bob Shiring. So Bob was on the best amateur team still in Pittsburgh for a couple years. And what was interesting about him was that he never went to college. Many of these great players at the time were Ivy League players, as I mentioned, but many kids in Pittsburgh just went to work for their families, went to work in the mills, policemen, firemen, and he ends up getting recruited to play from that amateur team onto the best professional team, the world champions in 1900, a new team in Pittsburgh called Homestead, which is a steel town just 5 miles outside of Pittsburgh. Homestead Steel became Carnegie Steel, became U.S. Steel. So Homestead wins the world championship, and they won this beautiful trophy cup, 11 Cup that year. And so then the next year, Philadelphia starts pro football. And they get challenged, Homestead does, to come and play in Philadelphia. They accept the challenge. They go out. They almost all died in a train crash. It was actually rougher, more dangerous to work in the mills or ride trains those days than it was to play football without a helmet. There were always, as you look at the papers, it's horrendous accidents in mills and on the railroads, people getting run over and so on. But in any case, they won the championship again, world champion. They won this big Stanley Cup type bowl. And so as we quickly go through the years, this was a program from that year. I ended up collecting, as I started getting interested in the memorabilia from that time to the extent I could. And fans, it was catching on. 10,000 people went to see that game, but they could never make money in this professional model. The weather was often a factor, floods, snow, people wouldn't come out as much as they thought. They just paid more than they made. And it seemed like pro football wasn't going to work. So the last year they did it in Pittsburgh, the teams merged and consolidated and went out of business. They tried even bringing the best baseball player of the time named Christy Mathewson onto the team. He had also played college football at Bucknell, but he won 3 World Series games pitching for the New York Giants in 1905. And they thought having him around would bring interest. It did a little bit, but not enough to save pro football in Pittsburgh. So Bob Shiring's kind of like Forrest Gump in a way. He always seems to end up next to the most famous person in every picture. So he was on that team, and but that was the end of pro football in Pittsburgh after they beat Philadelphia one more time, and their captain, Blondie Wallace, Charles Edgar Blondie Wallace, was a famous football player at Penn. They won national championships there, and he basically started pro football in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia rather, a real pioneer. He talked baseball manager Connie Mack, who is the top hat on there, into investing in running this professional team in Philadelphia, which didn't make any money either. Mack said he lost his shirt that year, but he had fun trying. So Pittsburgh wins. They split games. Pittsburgh won. And the second game, sort of like boxing, they were the world champions again. So every year, Shiring's team sort of beat Blondie's team, and they were kind of rivals, and they become like the 2 main characters in the story as things go on. Pro football died, but in Ohio, they were also playing some really good amateur football, and this little town of Massillon, some people, if they know football, might have heard of the Massillon Tigers. It's a big, probably the best high school, tradition, program in the country. And they had this rivalry with Canton that became known as the Canton Bulldogs, and they hate losing to Canton in anything. Like, they're just kind of a little brother complex, that they have to Canton. So this fascinating character named E.J. Stewart was their amateur quarterback. He was also the sports editor and a county city clerk of some kind, so he wore a lot of hats, and he came up with a concept that he could promote by games in the paper by stirring up this rivalry with Canton. He could sell tickets and sell papers, and he almost was single-handedly responsible for poking Canton's bear so much that they developed this rivalry that's kind of never died. And what he did was he sold the concept to his investors and business people in Massillon that by recruiting and bringing some of these ringers out from Pittsburgh that they could really take care of Canton. And they did. So they brought, while Blondie and his team moved east into a town called Franklin and won the world championship easily in 1903. Meanwhile, they were sort of outside of the Ohio sphere. Massillon brought in Shiring and 3 of his buddies from Pittsburgh, teammates, to help dominate the new Ohio league out there, sort of a loosely formed league. They really crushed everybody, were undefeated, but they were kind of, it was mysterious who they were. It was controversial whether professional football was ethical, but Massillon said, this is how, we roll. You can deal with it or not, but we're going to keep doing it. So in 1905, Canton said, okay, we're not going to let Massillon keep whooping us, and they went and got Blondie and all his friends from Philadelphia to come and play for Canton. So the rivalry just kind of moved to Ohio. And Blondie sort of was like Bill Parcells back in the day. He said, I'll come, but I want full control. I want to bring all my players and let me do it the way I want to do it. And they said, fine, in 1905, as long as you win. He said, I guarantee it. But he didn't pull it off. They even went and started bringing players from other schools, Michigan, Notre Dame. They all started coming and beating other teams by ridiculous scores because back then, if you scored, you got the ball back. You didn't actually ever give it. It was make it, take it. So if you were good enough, you never even gave up the ball. And they were that good. But the cost of these teams was very controversial. And they went on, and it all built up until their big matchup at the end of 1905. And as I said, big crowds came out, but Massillon defeated Blondie, and postcards, this is a national, that started getting sent around. It was becoming a national hit, pro football. And that's a program from that game that I discovered that's pretty special, only 3 of them known to exist. And Massillon always had the reputation of winning with less talent, but they were a better team. So it's kind of a life lesson that all teams of all-stars usually don't succeed as well as teams that play well together, no matter how good individuals are. And that's sort of the rap that Blondie and his more educated Ivy League people got labeled with over the less educated sort of blue-collar people from Pittsburgh and the local cops and firemen that just seem to have more character. And 1905 was also a big pivotal year in football because at the college level, back at Penn, where Blondie came from, there was a famous game between Penn and a little school called Swarthmore that had maybe the best player in the country despite being small, named Bob Tiny Maxwell. And Bob, while they weren't good enough to beat Penn, even with him, the famous incident happened when at the end of the game, quarterback Vince Stevens had said to him, look, Tiny, you play the greatest game we've ever seen. We've got the game. Relax. We're going to basically take a knee and end the game. And so he relaxed. And in the last play of the game, Stevenson called his own number, as it were, did a quarterback sneak, ran through the line, and blasted Tiny Maxwell in the face, broke open his nose, blood everywhere. And the legend is that a picture of it hit the newspapers, and President Teddy Roosevelt said, that's enough. He said, we've had 20-some people died of football injuries in 1905, many from a formation called the flying wedge, in which a V formation would attack the weakest defender and sort of crush them. And they didn't die on the fields necessarily, but in the hospital, broken necks, broken backs, and it was getting to be too much for the public to stomach. So Roosevelt was rumored to want to kill the sport, which he denied. He said he appreciated the ruggedness of masculine Christianity or something along those lines, and the Rough Rider, as he was called. And his son even played at Harvard, but he said, we're going to change the rules. So he got John Heisman and some other luminaries to form, join a committee that totally changed the rules going into the 1906 season, which included the forward pass for the first time. So it really opened up the game, and there was a line of scrimmage now. You couldn't do the flying wedge, and you had to get 10 yards instead of 5 and 4 downs instead of 3. So the game sort of started to open up and become less like rugby all the time. And it caught on, to some extent, but it took a while. But so in the middle of this rivalry between Massillon and Canton, the rules entirely changed, and Blondie now, since there were no rules basically as far as structured contracts, leagues, Blondie came up with an idea to outbid Massillon for some of their players. And he went in so whole hog in 1906 that he personally took financial responsibility for the team. When no professional team had ever made a profit, Canton wouldn't even sponsor the team anymore. He said, fine, I'll do it, just let me use your facilities. They said, fine. He gave them 10% or whatever, and he ran the show. So he paid all the players. He brought in whoever he wanted, including some of the Massillon players. So this added to the rivalry even more. And one of the players he brought in was the dirty, nasty Vince Stevenson from his alma mater at Penn. So it looked like things were going to get really, really ugly. And so what happened, Massillon said, fine, we'll go get Tiny Maxwell. He said, you want to get your revenge, Tiny? He said, I'm in. So now he was surrounded by better players, and they geared up for their end-of-season sort of Super Bowl. Meanwhile, there were rumors going around about games possibly being fixed. Now, gambling was everywhere back, and it's still everywhere, DraftKings and everything. But people remember the Black Sox in 1919 when the World Series was fixed. Gamblers are always trying to infiltrate sports. And Massillon, however, denied that there was a fix in the works. There was a rumor that they were going to split their games, and then there would have to be a third game. Something like Don King would orchestrate in boxing. There's going to be a third game. People were going to have to pay again and come to another game. And they said, not true. Believe us, really. So they played their games, and Blondie finally had his day. He had his big win in the first game, and they beat Massillon. And it sounded like he wanted to set up his life in Canton afterward, open a bar, and live out his life there as a sports hero. So a couple weeks later, they have the rematch, and Massillon gets, just as the skeptics said, Massillon won in Massillon, and they sort of retained their championship, and rumors of a third game were flying around. Notice the sort of gridiron field there with the checkerboard pattern. It's interesting. It's got its own story within the book, but of course, because of this, there was a scene in a bar in Canton that night at a hotel where the players were there, and somebody stood up and said, these games were fixed. And the players were upset and not happy that they lost, and they said, no, they were not. And so punches were thrown, and just like in a Burt Reynolds movie, somebody went through the glass window of the bar. And people wanted answers. They're like, what is going on? Were these games fixed or not? Nobody really knew what to think. But as far as the third game goes, they were not interested. They thought it was kind of too convenient. So what happened was, the next morning, the E.J. Stewart fellow, who was the sports editor for the Massillon paper, ran a front-page headline story that's gone down in history as pretty shocking. This odd title, Their Honor Inviolate, meaning the players did not violate their honor. So this kind of became like the Enron, MCI, Freddie Mac, crisis, or baseball crisis, at which the history of the sport was in peril. And he writes a story that says, the games were not fixed. However, there was an attempted bribe. And one of our own players, in fact, a fellow named Walter East, was on the team. Somehow he started the season with Canton. He ends up on Massillon, which seems suspicious. Maybe he was feeding information one way or the other. And accused him, and they kicked him off the team when they found out, he tried to bribe the captain, Bob Shiring, into losing, the game, having this scheme of splitting the games. And Shiring wouldn't do it. He reported it, they said, to the coach and the man, and they tried to bury the story until after the season to make sure people would still come to the games. But it became really messy anyway. And Walter East, for his part, said, you know what? Yep, it's true. I did it. So what? What are you going to do? He said, when I played college football at Pitt, I fixed a game. When I managed my baseball team at Akron in the minor leagues, we fixed games. So it's just kind of a fact of life. He didn't care. He had no shame. However, the paper also threw Blondie Wallace under the bus and accused him of colluding with East. Now, he didn't. He cared. He said, why are you throwing me under the bus? I didn't have anything to do with it. East, who didn't care about his own future, said, why are you blaming him? He didn't have anything to do with it. But this was the nature of the rivalry with Massillon and Canton that still burns today. And Blondie realized that his future in Canton was at risk, and he sued the Massillon newspaper and the team owners and some of the individuals for libel to protect his reputation. So it turns into a court drama, sort of like the Black Sox did several years later. The third game they ended up putting together just as a charity thing. They mixed sides, players played with different sides, just to raise as much money as they could to get the players back home. They didn't. Many of them didn't get paid. They didn't, because people didn't come out as usual in the numbers they expected. And some of them were stranded in Ohio. So they raised a few $100s. Only about 600 people came when 7,000 to 10,000 people would usually come to the games. And Wallace was in the hole about several $1,000. And but as things go, the little guy usually loses to the groups with deeper pockets, and he couldn't fight for long for his case. And officially, the history goes down that he dropped the case. It was dismissed for lack of his ability to pay his legal fees and court costs. So he goes down in history as kind of being a bad guy. The people said, well, look what happened to him later. His life spiraled into a life of crime. He went home to Atlantic City and used his celebrity to become the biggest bootlegger in the country during Prohibition. The feds chased him around, for transporting whiskey over state lines, and ultimately even suspected of murder of a Prohibition agent. And he ended up like Al Capone, getting sent to jail for tax evasion. It's all they could get people on. And he goes to prison and dies a young man of liver disease and alcoholism shortly after he gets out of jail. And so people said, well, heck, he was a bad guy anyway. He probably was involved in that scandal. And that's all people knew forever until now. And Shiring, for his part, the good guy, went home to Pittsburgh, ran the top amateur team back in Pittsburgh until 1910, was offered a job by Georgetown as a coach, and once again he was an honest fellow and did not accept the job because he admitted he didn't have a college degree, which he needed for the job. But he was ultimately inducted into the Pennsylvania Sports Hall of Fame posthumously. So went down in history as a good guy. And so pro football died after that for about a decade. People just didn't trust that it would work or that it was honest. And that was, again, the consequence, like in business, of any kind of fraud, that people just don't trust that you are on the up and up, and they aren't interested in your services. So it took 10 years or so to recover until a young fellow who was in the bar that night when the guy went through the glass window decided and was offered a job as to restart the Canton Bulldogs. And he said, "Are you kidding? This was the greatest time of my life. I'm in." You know, he said, I want to be part of that. And he had the idea to Jack Cusack to bring Jim Thorpe, the world's greatest athlete from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Native American, decathlon winner in the 1912 Olympics. And they said, sort of like Christy Mathewson, if you bring in a big star like that, maybe it'll work. And it did. People wanted to see Jim Thorpe play. And they started coming out again. And in a few short years, by 1920, there were 14 professional teams in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and New York that's all met in a car dealership in Canton and formed the NFL in 1920. And Thorpe was the first president of the league, sort of as a figurehead. And so the NFL, the Hall of Fame, the Pro Football Hall of Fame, not the NFL Hall of Fame, is in Canton because the NFL started there, not because pro football was born there. Thus, it was born in Pittsburgh, and Canton is the cradle, not the birthplace, of pro football for that reason. And so Canton started, the Bulldogs went into the NFL, won a couple championships. Massillon had a chance to go in, thought they were too small, and they didn't go in. But their legacy of the Massillon Tigers stays with their high school program. And they have this fabulous community there that's full of energy. And I've gone to a few, my first game in 2016 to experience this during my journey. And boy, I mean, it's special. Paul Brown, Earl Bruce, coach there, Chris Spielman was a great player that played there. And they always have players coming from Massillon and Canton into the NFL. And every year, this is the biggest rivalry. They have 15,000 people and plus coming to these high school games. And in their 100th anniversary game back in whenever that was, 1994, Massillon, as they always did, won again by 1 point on a missed extra point in overtime. And Canton's kicker was a fellow named Josh McDaniel, who's now the coach of the Oakland Raiders. And so that's how deep, you know, the history and tradition is there. It was like the most devastating thing in his life to miss that extra point. So Canton gets the Hall of Fame. Massillon still keeps winning every year, as they did a couple weeks ago. They won 11 out of 12 of the last 13 games against Canton, despite being the smaller school. So along the way, and figuring all this out, it became clear there was maybe a book to be written there, and to fill in a lot of gaps in history. And one of the coolest things about the book is that in 2012, Bob Shiring's great-grandson discovered those 2 trophies that we saw pictured in those newspapers at that old Homestead Club in Pittsburgh, just gathering dust in a closet, unknown to them what they even represented. And that great-grandson is me. So that was my inspiration. They call that burying the lead. To do this whole, you know, embark on this whole project was when I was going through a tough time, I decided to explore our family genealogy just for a little family project. And I had heard this story from my grandmother that Big Bob, as they called him, was this well-known guy, and he sort of became the patriarch of our family thanks to his reputation of integrity that he had earned and developed through his football career. Despite only having an 8th grade education, captaining these Ivy League All-Americans was something special, you know, about him that made them vote him as their leader. So at a time when I was struggling to find some meaning in my life and my career, you know, the value of that, you know, to sort of stay the course and that to build something meaningful, you know, that will last, was encouraging. They talk about the dark night of the soul. I sort of, you know, I guess it was sort of a dark year of the soul for me at that point, and in a period when I needed to figure out what I was going to do next. This sort of gave me a lot of encouragement. And as I started putting this story together, people said, you know, this is a much bigger deal than a family genealogy. You really have something special here. And so I realized I had three special things. I had the photographs, many of which were in here, that I inherited from my great-grandfather. And when my grandmother passed away, I took them out to the Hall of Fame, and they validated for me that they were very special. They had nothing like this from that period of time. Nobody had photographs like this. Sports Illustrated did a story in 2012 that I helped. Got a photo credit contributing some of these photos. And so I had the photos. I had, along the way, I solved the cold case of Blondie Wallace's alleged collusion. He had filed a suit, I mentioned, against the Maslin parties. And I saw in newspapers that there were depositions taken, but it never got to court. So I said, where did those go? What if there was a court file somewhere? So we went on a hunt with some of the help of the Maslin Museum researchers around courthouses, and we ended up finding the court file with all of the depositions from the case that solves the story, of what actually happened that's never been told. So combining the images with the story and solving the cold case, I don't want to spoil the story, but it's a very powerful outcome that reminds many people of the Field of Dreams. They sort of call my story the Field of Dreams of football, as if I was Kevin Costner. I kind of look like him, I think, says my wife. And it's a story of redemption. Everything about Field of Dreams is redemption. The redemption of the relationships between Kevin Costner and his father, the players in the Black Sox that wanted to be forgiven for fixing the World Series and play again. James Earl Jones, who wanted to write again as an author. The doctor, Burt Lancaster, who wanted to play baseball when he gave up his career to be a doctor. They all had a redemption moment. And it would be really powerful if Blondie had the same opportunity and all those players that were accused of fixing their sport to come out of the cornfields of Ohio and be forgiven for something that maybe they didn't do. And maybe their story could finally be told. So that's kind of what the story's about, deeper than just a football history. And that's me and my family at the Hall of Fame with the trophy that I discovered in the rotunda, which is a timeline, and the very first exhibit in the timeline there. And so I learned about this thing. Somebody, a very person wiser than myself, explained to me that they thought I completed something that Joseph Campbell, a famous mythologist, calls the hero's journey. And it's sort of this common thread that goes through many of our most famous stories and beloved stories, whether it's The Wizard of Oz, Star Wars, Field of Dreams, Indiana Jones, where you use the Force or build it and they will come, and go into the hurricane, the tornado, and a young person gets called into a magical, mystical experience and journey of discovery, often to connect with a descendant, like Kevin Costner's father and so on. And he calls it the Grail myth, and that effectively God sets, it's a search for the Holy Grail, that we're all looking for, and in a sense, God sets a prize out there. It's something for us to discover, that we're all meant to discover in our own way, to prove to him, to ourselves, that if we take this journey and leap of faith and follow this calling, that we'll discover something we're meant to discover, and which in the end, in some way, Campbell calls the Holy Grail. He thinks that the Grail may actually be our hearts, that discovering God in our hearts is the true Holy Grail. But it could be represented physically by a cup, or like in the Last Supper, in the top left here. But He said, look what you discovered. You discovered the actual shallots of football. That's crazy. So, if I'm blessed enough to actually have done this, it gives me goosebumps every time I talk about it. But the last stages of the journey are to come back to Kansas or the real world or whatever and share. The hero's job is to share his experience, his wisdom with his people, his tribe, to encourage them, like I'll encourage you all. We learn from this story that maybe you all have something that you're intended to discover yourself. If you had a curiosity about something in your family, World War II heroes, I meet all these people, a famous actress in your past, in your family, or somebody that brought the Statue of Liberty over. I meet all these people that say, I want to do that, but how did you do this? I need help. Where do I start? It's such a big project. So I want to, I'm available to anybody that has questions about how to start, how to research, how to get a publisher, how to get an editor, whatever it takes. Do it, because we're really the only generation that has the ability and opportunity to take our family stories verbally and our knowledge of technology to make it happen. Our kids won't have the family lore, and our parents didn't have the technology. So we have a really unique opportunity to make history. And so Campbell calls his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and it's a beautiful mosaic that if you step back, you sort of see a face of what might be Jesus or something spiritual. But the point is we can all do this kind of thing. So that's my thing. And that's what Franco Harris from the Steelers did the forward, and it's pretty magical. He had his own part in the most magical play of the NFL history, and where it goes from here, the people that I connect with everywhere, from famous people like Troy Aikman, Jerome Bettis, and Herschel Walker, to the average everyday people that I meet, even children. Something about the story resonates with people that don't even like football. And usually it's something about the family that they say, I get goosebumps just hearing about your great-grandfather. There's something there that it's in all of us that we want to know about where we came from. So there's even the big dream from going forward is a mini-series. We've written a script that maybe will get picked up by somebody someday, and that's where we're trying to go from here. But on the business side, I named a company Integra because of this, and I started my own company along the way 11 years ago doing business valuation consulting services, which in a way is like being a finance cop, and I get to wear the white hat and sort of resolve business valuation disputes and bring integrity to business. So if you want to get into the details and discover your own legacy, which is kind of my buzz phrase, we have books available out here, and you can go to gridironlegacy.com. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Greg. And we're fortunate enough tonight to have Jonathan Aberman here to ask a few questions and maybe take some questions from the audience if we have it. Okay.
Which chair do you like? I'll stay. I'm already here.
All right. So those of you who don't know, for years I had a national radio show on Sirius, and what I loved best about the show was I could go in any bookstore anytime, and I'd look at a book and I'd think, oh, it looks interesting, and I'd take it home, and if it was interesting, I'd call the publicist and I'd say, hey, can I interview the author? And they would willingly say yes. So this for me is an opportunity to imagine it's a Sunday night. Okay, you and I are just hanging out on the air. But I love doing stuff like this.
I have a face made for radio.
Yeah, me too, which is why I didn't do any TV. I love your book. I thought it was a lot of fun. I'm a big football fan. I was very struck by when we talked at lunch about the issue of integrity. Like you, I had these moments in my career during the Enron time. I actually represent Enron, like I told you, in a deal that shocking to think about now. Going and looking at ethics or looking at integrity, you named your company Integrity. How would you compare the scandal in pro football to the Black Sox baseball scandal? Because that got a lot more publicity. I think at the time, baseball was much bigger in the national psyche. But how would you compare the two?
Of course, it was bigger, so it made more headlines, and it was later. Media was increasingly available. In 1905, actually, interesting, 1906 was the first year that a pro football game was broadcast on the radio. In 1905, the year before, they used carrier pigeons.
Did they really?
To take
With little helmets on? That would have been cool.
Leather helmets.
That would have been really cool.
To get to the newspaper from the game. In the 1906 picture I had, you can actually see radio wires on the sideline. So media made it bigger. Baseball was bigger. Everybody knew Shoeless Joe Jackson, and he was sort of the Blondie Wallace of the story in a different way. But the difference was, ultimately I sort of alluded to, the Black Sox were guilty. I mean,
yeah, they were. Yes.
Shoeless Joe might not have been part of it. He knew about it, and that's why he was one of the 8 men out. But they did it, and they were mad at their owner, Charles Comiskey, for not paying them, and they were, and they decided to take the money, and they tried to get out of it. If you ever saw that movie 8 Men Out, and then the gamblers threatened them, and they kind of had to go through with it. But once you're in, you're kind of in, and it was never clear that the football players did it, but it wasn't clear that they didn't. So the story needed to be finished.
It's really striking. So for those of you that aren't baseball geeks like I am, the 1919 White Sox were the only major league team that actually demonstrably fixed a World Series. And the greatest player on their team, they had some unbelievable players, was a country boy named Joe Jackson, Shoeless Joe Jackson, who was literally the Juan Soto or Bryce Harper of his time. He was an unbelievable athlete. And the tragedy was that he was a country boy and he didn't participate in the fixing, and yet he was tainted by it. He could never play baseball again. And it's interesting, the analogy, compare him with, with the fellow who ended up, well, at least he wasn't a dean. I mean, at least he didn't do that. So, but yeah, he ended up in prison, right?
Who was that?
The guy who you were talking about.
Oh, in prison.
Yes,
he did.
That struck me. I mean, I don't know. Prison gets my attention.
Was it nature or nurture? Was he a bad guy, so he became a bootlegger anyway?
Yeah.
Or was he forced into a life because he couldn't get another job? He couldn't stay in football. He didn't finish college at Penn. He didn't have anything else to do.
So you have gone and looked at the history of this sport that now dominates the airwaves. Do you think that the people that started playing this game had any idea it was going to become this international phenomenon? I mean, we were just watching a game Sunday from Germany, of all places.
Not at all. I mean, I think they did it back then to survive. Just try to make a few extra dollars. Basically, they did it because they enjoyed it. I think more than anything, like most athletes, they loved it. I was a skinny kid from Pittsburgh that became a tennis player. I was never big enough to play football like most of the large people in the Midwest, and I went out and played on the tennis team at Georgetown. Not many great tennis players come from Pittsburgh, but nonetheless.
Surprising somehow.
Yeah, I don't know. There was a few. So even into the 70s, when the Steelers were winning 4 Super Bowls, those guys had side jobs as insurance salesmen and things. I met one of them, a guy named J.T. Thomas, who was a lesser-known defensive back. He said he owns some Applebee's restaurants. He said, "Boy, if I wouldn't be owning an Applebee's if I made what they make, now." Yeah,
the money's really that definitely has changed the sport. It's funny. I think back to the history of you mentioned soccer and rugby. I lived in the UK for a long time, and the joke when I grew up there was that rugby was played by gentlemen. A game of gentlemen playing a thuggish game, and soccer was a thuggish game. A gentleman's game played by thugs, right? Very class-ridden. Upper class played rugby, lower classes played soccer. Was there a similar divide between baseball and football in this country? It seems like there was. Baseball was more sort of, working class, and football was very collegiate.
That's true. Actually, I thought you were going the other direction. I was going to say baseball always had the reputation for being the rubes, sort of.
Right.
A lot of their nickname, Rube Waddell, and they were lower class. I think Joe Jackson was illiterate.
Yeah.
He couldn't even sign his name, but with an X when he admitted unknowingly to,
That's what made it so tragic. He had no idea.
He didn't know what he was doing. So, Christy Mathewson was unusual at the time. He was called the Christian gentleman, and he was an educated. He was a national icon because he was not, he was so different from everybody else. He was so honest that he would call himself out when they called him safe, sometimes.
Mhm.
So the football players did tend to have the Ivy League pedigree, and it was the way of establishing their reputation. Many of them went into politics and became judges and prominent in society.
So it's interesting to me, you started the presentation and ended it around the concept of integrity. What do you think sports really does for us?
I was asked in my interview at Freddie Mac, I remember what sports did, what playing tennis at Georgetown did. And I said, you know what? It was a great question, and I just answered on the spot. It taught me to perform under pressure. I had to work on the trading desk at Freddie Mac. You have to execute quickly and correctly, and it didn't bother me. I wouldn't freak out. That you had to get your second serve in when you were down to break point at 4-5 in the third set. And you just stayed calm and poised under pressure. I think that was the biggest, value and the self-esteem and confidence that lets you know that you're as good as anybody else, even if you're from Pittsburgh and you're working on a trading with a bunch of people from New York.
Right.
You can hang.
Well, it's interesting. You were talking about your career, and you did have an unerring ability to fund companies with corrupt senior leadership. So, more seriously, though, do you look at your career and do you, when you talk with young people now, what do you tell them? I mean, a lot of people are going to face the challenges of working in an organization that may have values that they don't share. What do you advise them to do?
One story I didn't share, even before Freddie and Unisys, which it's a government kickback scheme here in Virginia in the 80s. When I was an intern at the U.S. Small Business Administration one summer in Pittsburgh, the district director called me into his office, and he was impressed with me because I went to Georgetown, and I was from Pittsburgh. I didn't know what he wanted, and he said, have a seat, and he wanted somebody to talk to. He asked me, theoretically, what would I do if somebody asked me to do something in my job that I thought was unethical? And I'm like, what do you mean? And obviously he was in that situation and he couldn't talk to anybody. And so we kind of got into a little bit without him telling me too much what was involved. And that's a tough question when you're put in a potential spot of having to be a Nazi soldier to keep your job or support your family and do something as a lower level person that you might know is wrong, but you won't think you'll be held accountable. Are you going to quit your job and leave, or are you going to go along to get along? And situational ethics is a dangerous thing, but that's a decision people have to make for themselves. But at some point, you just have to know when you are not comfortable, and if it's something where it's very hurtful to somebody financially, physically, or yourself potentially, your reputation is gold. You might just have to leave, and at some point. It happened to me, especially at WorldCom, where they were asking me to do things that I knew were wrong for the company, and I got passed over for a promotion for somebody who was lesser qualified that was going along to get along, and I said, I'm done. This whole internet thing sounds kind of fun. I think I'll go join a .com and see where that goes, and it was exciting. So. Your conscience has to be your guide, and at some point you have to know when you're out.
That's right. I have a question or two, but does anybody have any questions? I've talked a lot. Okay. So, how hard was it to write a book?
10 times harder than I thought, or more. I didn't know what I didn't know, and if I did, I probably would never have done it. It took so long. It took 15 years from 2007 when I discovered those photos to researching them, identifying them, thinking that there was a book there, knowing that there was a book there, trying to find somebody else to write it, whether it was Michael Lewis of The Blind Side. Or
did you try to get Michael to write your book?
I did. Somebody I knew in my village knows Michael Lewis. And he said, I get this stuff every day, I don't need another idea.
Yeah.
I tried to get Laura Hillenbrand from Seabrisket. I couldn't get past her admin. I was turned down by all the best.
Well, you were you had good
tried.
search image. You did.
I tried.
Yeah.
I gave it the college try. But eventually a publisher said to me, I will do this only if you write it yourself. Because it's your story. It's your passion. A ghostwriter will not write it as well as you will. So you're a smart guy. Good luck. And there I went, and with a working wife and two, talented, busy kids, and just pecked away at it. And my spare time, with fortunately my own company, maybe God freed me up for the ability to do that, and eventually figured it out, and launched it on September 8th, and it's taken off beyond my own expectations, and everybody else said you'll never sell even 10,000. Most authors never sell $10,000 worth of books, they say, and it's not about the money at all. But I sold nearly 500 books in a pre-sale on a Kickstarter, like Indiegogo crowdfunding thing. So I sold about $25,000 worth of books before it even launched, and I sold about as many since September since they launched. So, and it's all on my own. I don't have the Random House, or I'm selling them out of my garage.
Or down the hall. In just a minute.
At a university near you. But I'm trying to figure it out and how to get some larger distribution right now. But changing hats from being an author to a marketer, I've got digital marketing people trying to help me, PR people. They all want to charge me a lot more than I think I'll ever make back. Paying a PR person $5,000 a month for a $50 book doesn't seem to make sense.
It does to them.
It does,
Yeah, it's funny about that.
We'll see what happens.
But anyway, Greg, thanks a lot for being with us, and you are going to be down the hall for a little while. So
stop by, say hello.
Check out the book. It really is. It is a really cool. If you've got a football fan in your family for Christmas, I read it over the weekend. It's really a cool book. Greg, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.